But more recently, I came across a video where he was arguing that Christianity has stifled science down through the ages. And he had about a 15-minute lecture. It was in a debate in a church in Texas about where he was making all sorts of claims about the history of science and Christianity. And every single claim he made was wrong. It was astonishing. I mean, if he was trying to get things completely wrong as a way of undermining atheism and making atheists look stupid, he couldn't have done a better job. It was absolutely astounding. And I had several people, this is just in April this year, I had several people send me this video and go, look at this. And I just couldn't let it pass. I had to write an article on it. So what I do in this article is I basically take line by line every statement that he makes, and then in some detail explain what he's gotten wrong. Just to give you one example, he claims that the church in the late antiquity and in the Middle Ages taught that the earth was flat because the Bible said that the earth was flat. That's wrong. The church did not teach that. The church had worked out very early on that the biblical references that clearly are to a flat earth could be interpreted and should be interpreted symbolically, allegorically, and not literally. And this is because some of the early church intellectuals were well versed in ancient Greek science and natural philosophy, and so knew the arguments, knew the evidence that showed that the earth is actually round. So they'd sorted that out long before the Middle Ages. The idea that the church in the Middle Ages taught that the earth was flat is a 19th century myth. And I had thought that it was slowly starting to filter into common knowledge that it is a myth and that the medieval church did not teach that the earth was flat. But it appears that that hasn't filtered all the way to Texas because Aaron Ra still seems to believe that the medieval church taught that the earth was flat. And it's just dead wrong. If you open up any medieval textbook on cosmology, what you find are the arguments straight from Aristotle that show that the earth is round. When Thomas Aquinas, who wrote the enormous theological textbook in the 13th century, the Summa Theologica, right at the beginning of that book, where he wanted to give an example of an objective scientific fact that everyone agreed with, he picked the idea that the earth was round. We even have medieval folk tales about a guy who walked into the east and travelled so far that he ended up coming back to his home from the west, which only makes sense if everyone understood that the earth was round. And we have depictions in churches of Jesus holding a globe in his hand. Everyone knew that the earth was freaking round, yet Aaron Ra doesn't seem to have grasped that. There is actually a very good book on the whole topic called Inventing the Flat Earth, which is, it's not a very thick book, but it's by Jeffrey Burton Russell, and he basically takes how the myth arose, and it largely, unfortunately, we can blame you Americans, it largely arose out of some founding myths about Christopher Columbus, and then permeated your public school system in the 19th century, and so is still widely promulgated. Neil deGrasse Tyson, who you would think would be a guy who checks his facts, is still on Twitter, still talking about how the idea that the earth was flat was being taught by the church in the Dark Ages, which is complete crap. Oh, yeah. And when he gets corrected on it, he just brushes it aside because, he's a science dude and he knows everything.
Wow.
That guy's a bit of a dick, by the way.
Neil deGrasse Tyson, that's funny. Well, the anti-theists that I encounter, just from the moral psychology perspective, I mean, they're very much trying to establish a narrative. They have a central premise that religion is evil, and this is an argument that they like to put towards that premise. If religion is holding back our scientific advancements, it goes to that narrative that religion is evil. But like, as you say, I mean, I can think of three guys off the top of my head that the church financed, like Copernicus, Mendel with his genetics, Newton was an avid Christian. So I mean,
well, this is referred to as the conflict thesis. It's also known as the Draper-White thesis. So Andrew Dickson White and John William Draper two American writers. They weren't historians in the late 19th century. And they were vehemently anti-Christian, in particular, particularly anti-Catholic, and were writing in the wake of the controversy over Darwinian evolution. And so what they did was they sort of took that conflict, which is real. There was definitely and is an ongoing conflict between some forms of Christianity, not all, but some very conservative forms of Christianity and science on that particular issue. But they took that and then projected it back over the whole of Western history to try to argue that there has always been this conflict. Unfortunately, they were wrong, and so a lot of the stuff that they used as their evidence is distorted, is misinterpreted, or is in some cases just made up. The Draper-White thesis has been rejected by historians of science for about 100 years. So it's a bit ridiculous that people like, unfortunately, Sam Harris, the people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, and people like Aron Ra continue to perpetuate it. So there's a recent book actually on the history of that historical question, the warfare between science and religion, the idea that wouldn't die. And this is a collection of essays by some of the leading historians of science working in the world today on why the conflict thesis is wrong, but more interestingly, why it's permeated our popular conceptions of history, and why even when you show people that it's wrong, they resist it. So you just mentioned Copernicus, for example. Aron Ra in that video that I debunked held up Copernicus as an example of the church holding back science.
What?
Oh yeah. Well, because when the Galileo affair, which was more about theology and politics than it was about science, but anyway, when the Galileo affair happened in the early 1600s, part of the fallout from that political and theological struggle was that Copernicus's books weren't allowed to be published without correction. Right? They weren't banned, but they weren't allowed to be published without some notes in the margin saying, he's saying this is fact, this bit's actually only theory, which at that time was true, by the way. Mm-hmm. But Copernicus himself not only had no trouble with the church at all, but was sponsored by a Bishop Tiedemann of Ulm, was encouraged by the Pope. The Pope had a public lecture in the Vatican Gardens by one of Copernicus's pupils, Johann Wittgenstein. And the Pope, 3 cardinals, the papal physician and the rest of the papal court sat there in the garden, drinking wine on a summer evening, and afterwards were delighted by the whole idea, thought the concept was fascinating. And later on, one of the cardinals who heard about that wrote to Copernicus saying, apparently you're writing a great big thick book on this. Anything I can do to help you, I'll do. If you want me to send you some money to send me produce a copy that I can read. So these guys were fascinated by it. They were not trying to shut him down. What happened though is when Copernicus's final book was released, just in the year in which he died, people read the book and actually found that there were some still quite serious scientific objections to the idea of heliocentrism. And that's because the Copernican model is mostly wrong. It's right about the sun being at the center. It's wrong about everything else. So not surprisingly, there are major scientific problems with it. And these were recognized straight away. People worked out that Copernicus's model was good as a calculating device, pretty good in some cases, but that's what it was mainly used for. It wasn't until Kepler came along and then Kepler's physics was then further supported by Newton that the tide really turned in favor of heliocentrism. In Galileo's time, there was probably 5 or 6 people in the whole of Europe who accepted heliocentrism, who accepted Copernican heliocentrism. The overwhelming majority of scientists, astronomers, natural philosophers, thought that Galileo was wrong. And so the church didn't sort of say, well, we're rejecting the scientific consensus. The church actually said, and made it quite clear, we've checked with the scientists. They say you're wrong. So here's the theological implications of that. You can't go around interpreting the Bible on the basis of this scientific idea that everyone says is absurd in philosophy, in other words, scientifically wrong. which changes the whole conception. The church had the science on its side. It's just that the science changed about 80 years later. So everyone's sort of saying, "Oh, bad church for being wrong." Well, they couldn't help it. That was what the scientific consensus was. It's easy for us to be wise in hindsight. And Galileo was wrong about pretty much everything as well. He thought that the orbits of the planets were circular and that there was these various sort of epicycles and that the tides were caused by the Earth's rotation. All totally wrong, and all could be seen to be wrong at the time. But he was a very stubborn old man. So the idea that the whole Copernican and Galileo thing was the church trying to hold back science. It wasn't. They sponsored Copernicus. They encouraged him. They wanted to publish his book. And then with Galileo, that was, as I said, more about politics and theology than it was about science. And the church had the science of the day on its side. That changes that whole story. Aaron Ra knows nothing of any of that.
So this has been a fascinating dialogue. I'm curious what kind of terms you're on with Aaron Ra. Like, if I could organize a debate between the two of you guys, is there too much bad blood between you? I mean, I'm a pretty smooth talker sometimes. Maybe I could mend a fence or two if
people have tried to, but he's not interested. He has responded sort of. I saw some exchanges on Facebook where people were saying, "Hey, this guy's written this article that's basically ripped you a new one. What's your response?" He picked out. He obviously didn't even read it. He picked out a couple of things that he quibbled over, which he was wrong about anyway, and they were minor points. So I don't think he's terribly interested. I really think he actually doesn't care about history. I think he actually just wants to use history as a kind of a quarry with which to dig out some nuggets of stuff to chuck at Christianity. There's a very good book that came out last year by a guy called Nathan Johnson, who's a historian. This is a peer-reviewed monograph. It's called The New Atheism, Myth and History. And it's basically talking about what I'm talking about. It's saying, unfortunately, the new atheisms, the so-called anti-theistic atheists, don't use history in any kind of rational way. They use it in a polemical way, and they aren't actually interested in history. They just really sort of take some bits and pieces. They don't check their facts, and they just use it to kind of throw it at Christianity. This is an excellent book, heavy reading, but I've got a detailed review of this on my blog as well. But these guys just don't care. They don't care about history. What they actually care about is getting a bigger stick with which to hit Christianity. It's the same with mythicism. The reason many people, and I've had them tell me this, the reason they like mythicism is that it's much more powerful for them to say to a Christian, Jesus didn't even exist, than it is to say Jesus wasn't what you claim he was. The real reason they like mythicism, when it comes down to it, is that for many of them, is that it's the biggest possible weapon that they can use against Christianity, which means that they're not coming at it from a rational place. They're coming at it from an emotional place. And that usually leads to bad outcomes.
Yeah, man, that's some sobering things to think about. I hope that you'll send me some links to some of the books that you've recommended here, and I can put them in the description. There's so many of those books seem very fascinating to me, and I think that I actually looked at a couple of them on Audible. The one about the scientific history, the claims of that are out of balance with that have been debunked. So, do you have anything?
Yeah, well, probably the one that I would also recommend just on that. This one's probably a bit more sort of easy reading and more for a wider popular audience. This is a book called Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths About Science and Religion. It's a collection of fairly short, fairly accessible essays. And it was edited by a guy called Ronald L. Numbers, who's probably the leading historian of science working in the field today. This debunks lots of those common myths, like Christianity holding back science, Christianity teaching that the earth was flat, Galileo being imprisoned and tortured, which he wasn't, Copernicanism demoting humans from the center of the cosmos, which it didn't. So this is a great book. Interestingly, your my mutual friend Michael gave a copy of this to Aaron Ra at one of their debates, and he left it behind. He didn't want to read it.
You know, I think that might be the
Who's the
book that
rationalist here?
I think that
Yeah,
might be the book that I looked up because I remember Michael telling that story on the live stream that he did with
yeah,
you. I think that might have been why I looked it up. I was like, who's
that's a great
turning
book.
down a book? Jeez. A
Yeah,
free
I know.
book, at least you can put it on your bookshelf, even if you never read it, and you can say, oh, yeah, well, I've seen the evidence against me. So, do you want to promote anything before we end the stream?
Well, look, what I would say is there are counter arguments to everything that I've said because this is history that we're talking about. So there are always counter arguments. So lots of people say, but Richard Carrier says, but such and such says. Sure. What I would say is pay attention to what the leading experts say. I'm not a leading expert, right? I'm just a dude with a hobby. I've got a history degree, but I don't have a PhD in history. I've got a master's in a related field, but not necessarily in history. But nothing that I'm saying here is my ideas, right? I'm not presenting any kind of radical new idea. I'm presenting mainstream consensus stuff. This is why I keep saying, have a look at these books. So don't pay attention to me. Pay attention to the people that I'm referring to. If you look at my blog, every single article I have links to books and articles all the way through. Pay attention to those. And just the final point is be very careful about confirmation bias. We are all inclined towards ideas that sort of fit with what we would like to believe. And one of the things that the study of history has taught me is stop, think, be skeptical.